Welcome, everyone. We usually give it a few more minutes when we're in person, but because we are all back to being at home, let's go ahead and start. Welcome to the Stanford Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. Thank you all for joining us today. This is part of our weekly seminar series that has typically been in person this year in a hybrid format, but unfortunately the first seminar or two will likely be fully virtual as Stanford resumes and tries to keep everybody safe during this Omicron surge. We hope that all of you had a safe and healthy holiday and New Year. So today is January 6th, the anniversary of the riots at the US Capitol last year as Congress was certifying the election results in favor of Joe Biden over Donald Trump. We are fortunate today to have with us Hakeem Jefferson to engage in a discussion about the events of January 6th and their implications for American democracy. We won't have a formal presentation today, but instead we'll just talk kind of openly and freely about where things stand and what the future holds. And we'll open it up for Q&A after about 30 minutes of discussion between me and Hakeem to the rest of the audience. So please, if you have any questions, use the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and we'll get to them in the Q&A portion. Let me introduce today's speaker. Hakeem Jefferson is an assistant professor of political science at Stanford University. He's a new faculty of CDDRL, and we're super happy to have him on board. And this year is a fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences in Palo Alto. Hakeem, why don't you go ahead and start us off by discussing some of the things you wrote in your fantastic article in the San Francisco Chronicle today.
Thank you, Didi. I'm so happy to be in conversation with you on what is a fairly somber day. It's been a crazy busy morning, but I'm glad we got to park for a few minutes to think seriously about the events of last year. And I thought I got us started just by reading and giving voice to some of the points that I made in the Chronicle essay, which I hope that others will spend some time reading. And then, Didi, I'm excited to be in conversation with you. So why don't I spend the first few minutes just sharing with you some of what I've written in this Chronicle essay before being in conversation with Didi. As we pause to reflect on the horrific events of January 6th, we find ourselves at another moment of reckoning as a country. At this time of great peril for American democracy, we are forced to ask ourselves what kind of country we want ours to be. Will we hold fast to our democratic ideals, or will these ideals lose out to those opposed to the promise of multiracial democracy? The attack on the nation's capital was a vivid reminder of how fragile our democracy is. But we cannot lose sight of the more routine attacks that fail to capture our attention in the same way the spectacle of January 6th did. Across the country, Republican elected officials are doing whatever they can to make it harder for people to vote. Instead of expanding access to the ballot, Republicans are closing polling locations, removing ballot drop boxes, decreasing the window of time for absentee voting, implementing restrictive voter identification requirements, and doing all they can to limit the franchise in ways that harken back to the post-Reconstruction era. And this is only part of the story. Partisan drawn redistricting maps will allow Republicans to continue to wield outsized power in the halls of Congress and state legislatures. And it gets worse still. Republican legislatures across the country are advancing laws that will allow them to supplant and subvert the democratic will of the people by empowering them to replace local elections officials with partisan hacks willing to do the bidding of the most extreme forces of the Republican Party. These attacks on our democracy are egregious and unconscionable and should be met with the same anger and frustration that many of us felt while watching the events of January 6th unfold. Let me be clear on this point. Those who stormed the Capitol on January 6th should be held accountable for their actions. Democracies cannot countenance such violent responses to democratic outcomes. On this, there can be no debate or disagreement. But democracies cannot, while calling themselves democracies, countenance routine attacks on the very foundation of democratic governance, the right of every citizen to participate in free and fair elections and to have their voice heard and reflected in the halls of power. The right to vote is sacrosanct, it is sacred, it is preservative of all other rights. When the right to vote is threatened, democracy is weakened. At this moment, our nation's democracy hangs in the balance. We are in the 11th hour. Democracy's vital signs are weak. Democracy is on life support and its detractors are prepared and positioned to pull the plug. It is no longer hyperbole to acknowledge how precarious the future of American democracy is, how close we are to living in an authoritarian state. It is not outside the bounds of reality to imagine that we could soon live in a country where one political party maintains power not by popular will, but by force, sometimes violent, but primarily through the corrupt abuse of legal and political means and institutions. January 6th was devastating for many obvious reasons, but it was devastating for another reason. It fooled many into believing that this was as bad as it could get. It fooled many into believing that our democracy will die in a violent uprising. We believe this pair of tales at our own peril and at a great cost to American democracy. It can get worse. And as political scientists Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziplat remind us, democracies don't just die in made-for-TV insurrections. They often, and I quote, erode slowly in barely visible steps. As I watch the clock tick away, I'll admit that I'm nervous about the outcome and not sure how this will all turn out. But here is what I do know. Democracy will lose if its proponents fail to meet this moment with the urgency it requires. So today, on the anniversary of that horrific attack on the Capitol, we should recommit ourselves to the hard work, the practice of making real the promise of democracy that guarantees liberty and justice for all. And in that spirit, we should demand that Congress passes the Freedom to Vote Act and other democracy-enhancing legislation, even if it means reforming the Senate filibuster to overcome Republican opposition. The stakes at this moment are far too high to do otherwise. Time is running out. Didi, I'm excited to be in conversation with you.
Okay, that was a really wonderful and clear warning call about the stresses on American democracy right now and how actually things have gotten worse since the violence on January 6th. I want to take up 2 points to start. We'll start with this question of the filibuster. So it seems as if norms are always contested in a democracy, with both sides arguing that norms are infringed, maybe when they're not getting what they want or when they see it as being politically advantageous to claim that. And in this era of hyper-partisanship and polarization, there can't even be basic agreement on what the procedures and rules of democracy are. So Chuck Schumer has said he wants to pass the Freedom to Vote Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, and that he will eliminate the filibuster to do so. What do you think are the prospects for his success in eliminating the filibuster? And how do you think, what are people's public attitudes about that? Do people care? Will they see it as an infringement of norms, or will it actually be seen as a way to get work done in a Democratic majority Congress and presidency?
Yeah, so when I think about the filibuster and other tools of bipartisanship, I'm often forced to ask myself, to whose benefit? To whose benefit do we maintain these norms, these tools, these procedures? The filibuster is a status quo maintaining tool. It's a status quo maintaining device. Some have argued that it forces compromise and bipartisanship. But we know from the historical record that the filibuster has been used previously to stand in the way of advancing civil rights legislation. And that's what it's being used to do today. And it's not even the filibuster, it is the threat of objecting to this piece of legislation. And so I think Chuck Schumer making the argument that he will put on the floor a vote to advance these pieces of legislation, and in the face of Republican opposition, will vote to have a filibuster carve out, at least for these democracy enhancing policies. I think it's the right thing to do, particularly as we see Republican obstruction to strengthening democracy. I've said elsewhere that expecting Republicans to join hands with Democrats on these pieces of legislation is like asking the arsonist to join hands with the fire department to put out the fire. It is the Republican Party that is advancing these restrictive voting rights pieces of legislation. It's the Republican Party that's enacting laws across the country that will allow them to supplant and subvert the will of the American people. It would be great if there was a bipartisan effort to advance these pieces of legislation. The effort to undermine American democracy is a partisan effort. And it is unfortunately the case that to advance and strengthen American democracy, it appears that that too must be a partisan effort. And I've made this case elsewhere with colleagues that Democrats, in the face of this stringent opposition, must do everything they can at this moment to advance and strengthen democracy. I don't know the prospects. I mean, we have two senators, Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, who have stated publicly that they are resistant to these kinds of carve-outs. Folks on the Hill say that these conversations, especially with Joe Manchin, are ongoing. But I think if Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema refuse to have this democratic carve-out, they are as guilty of undermining American democracy as their Republican colleagues. And I think at this moment, when these active conversations are ongoing and people are wondering what it is they can do, I think in every place we should call on elected officials to not just be private supporters of these pieces of legislation, but to publicly meet this moment. And Joe Biden is finally catching up and doing this. And I'm glad that he's finally getting some fight on this issue. And I worry that it might be too little too late.
That's right. So there is the quote that you said from How Democracies Die from Levitsky and Ziblatt, that democracy erodes slowly. It's difficult to make democracy per se a salient election issue. It means so many different things to different people. And as we know, the Republicans have long used claims of fraud and irregularity to enact their own reforms of the election process, i.e. voting identification laws, and measures to restrict ballot access in what they call an effort to clean up election administration. And I saw an op-ed by Yuval Levin, who's an AEI scholar, therefore sort of center-right, who said that when Democrats argue that there are problems of voter suppression or that voting rights continues to be an issue, that they are also seeding distrust in elections. My question for you is, how do we make the public aware of all of the efforts at the state level, in Secretary of State elections, or in these state level laws to give the legislature partisan oversight of a neutral election administration process? How do you make voters aware that that is a problem for democracy? And how do you mobilize people around that civically and at the grassroots level?
Yeah, as a political scientist and one who studies public opinion, I understand well that people have a lot of other going on. They've got a lot of other stuff that's taking their attention. And in a healthy democracy, people should be able to go about their day doing the sort of things that ordinary folks do without worrying about all of this other stuff. That's not the moment that we're in, unfortunately. And so I think it's the job of those of us who have access to publics to speak plainly and to tell the truth. And that's what I'm doing. I know that's what you're doing. That's what a number of our colleagues at CDDRL are doing. And importantly, this is what activists and people on the ground have been doing for a long time. While others of us were busy, doing theoretical work or what have you, activists on the ground in places like Georgia and Texas, my home state of South Carolina, they've long been engaged in this effort. And so I think in many ways, it's political elites particularly at the national level, who are catching up to the hard work that Black women, queer activists, and others have been doing for a long time. And we see it in the voice, or we hear it in the voice of Senator Reverend Raphael Warnock, who speaks so clearly and eloquently about the crisis of this moment. And that's because he's not new to this, right? This isn't a new issue for him. He's been planted in Georgia. He preaches at Ebenezer Baptist Church, a site of a lot of civil rights history. And so I want to be clear here that there are some members of the public for whom this is a new issue, for whom this is a sort of side issue. But for the Black and brown folks I know from South Carolina, the right to vote has long been an issue that people have been agitating around. We see it with the Poor People's Campaign and Reverend Barber. We see it with all of these activists. And so by noting that, yeah, I wish a lot more people were taking to the streets and sort of agitating about this, I want to give due to those folks who are doing the hard work. And I think in this moment, those folks have done their work. We should keep doing that work, but those folks have done their work. It is the job of political elites and the Congress and our president to really make the case, to do the hard work to get us across the finish line.
So there have been many reports of an uptake in political violence especially since the COVID pandemic began. Some of it is racially motivated. Some of it has been motivated by liberation movements who protest COVID protocols. And there's also been many more guns, states that have liberalized their gun laws, and the Supreme Court is going to consider, open carry laws across states, these kinds of things. So we also know there have been many more gun accidents in individual homes, especially among children. How do we think about the sort of health of the body politic when violence is on the rise and when there are many more sort of ammunitions in the population? How do you see this connecting to January 6th and to also problems of organized white nationalism that have been on the rise since Obama's presidency?
Yeah, we're sick in many ways, aren't we? We're sick from COVID and sick from the problems of white supremacy and a kind of white nationalism that has taken hold in our body politic, not just on the fringes. And this is, I think, a really important point to make, is that it's easy when we think about a kind of practice of white supremacy as just being the politics of skinheads or Klansmen and women. However, we see the kind of pining for white power and the sort of permanent status of a white majority. We see that as a core feature of Republican national and state level politics, right? And so all of the examples that you raised, from these liberation movements, these anti-masking campaigns, we saw in Michigan, where I went to graduate school, this group of folks have a plot to kidnap the governor because of her COVID policies. We saw it in Charlottesville, as I wrote at 538, 2 days after the insurrection last year. We saw it in the insurrection. What is the common thread here? What joins these seemingly disparate pieces of American politics together? It is the investment in white supremacy. It is an investment in the permanent status of white power. And people push back on that. They don't like the language of white supremacy or white nationalism because it seems too extreme. It seems too nebulous. It seems too otherworldly. Like, what the hell are you talking about when you invoke it? Well, what we're talking about is the perceived loss of status that many of these white Americans who are taking up arms, who are threatening to kidnap the governor, who are storming the Capitol. What we are seeing is not just an act of extreme political polarization, right? What we are seeing is, as Victor Ray and I write in 538 today, what we are seeing is another moment of racial reckoning. We are seeing people push against the perceived progress of racial and ethnic minorities, a perceived shift in the racial landscape in this country. And we can't understand it. I don't care how uncomfortable it makes us. We can't understand the crisis of American democracy, the crisis of this moment, without thinking seriously about the long history of racial backlash, the investment in white supremacy, and the fact that this is no longer just operating on the fringe of our politics. It is part and parcel of Republican politics today. And I think that is the scariest part of what ails us as a country.
So you had mentioned earlier, Congress and the president need to be fully on board with voting rights. And you're right, they campaigned on the issue of democracy and restoring democratic, norms after Trump. They made the For the People Act, now called the Freedom to Vote Act, like the signature piece of legislation, one of them at least, when Joe Biden first took office. But then we have the thorny issue of the courts. We know that there has been a long-running conservative project to ensure that there is a conservative voice in many of the courts, state courts, federal courts, and the Supreme Court. So there is a good chance that cases that rise to the Supreme Court that have to do with racial discrimination or inclusion and questions related to voting rights and democracy will see a lot of deference to the states or an effort to abolish what the Federalist Society has long called, discriminating on the basis of race through non-race neutral policies. Mm-hmm. What do you think about the Supreme Court's role in either in judicial review, I suppose, of majoritarian legislation? And do you think that the Supreme Court is also an institution that is in need of reform?
Yeah, of course. We often, and I think this is a trap that many folks on the left have fallen into, in believing the courts to be the site of rights expansion.
Right.
We can think about these moments in American history where the courts have advanced the rights of marginalized folk. We can think about the promise, at least, of Brown v. Board of Education. We can think about a series of other labor rights cases and the like, where rights have been expanded. Those are, unfortunately, exceptions to a more general rule. The court is a status quo maintaining institution. And the current court, the Roberts Court, has shown itself antagonistic to the rights of marginalized folk. It was Chief Justice John Roberts who took the teeth. It was his majority that took the teeth out of the Voting Rights Act, right? And so the courts at present are not an institution where folks who believe in democracy should expect to have their fair day in court. The courts instead are an extension of a right-wing movement and the Republican Party that is attempting to subvert and undermine American democracy. That's not a very hopeful or optimistic read of the courts, but unfortunately, I think it's the right read of the court. You can't look at the court's responses to cases related to partisan gerrymandering. Mm-hmm. You can't look at the court's response to voting rights cases and the like, or affirmative action cases that are coming down the pike, and think that this is a court that will seek to expand the rights of racial and ethnic minorities or other marginalized folk. And so I think there's a lot to be said about calls for the court to be expanded or reformed to the court. I think if one supports democracy, if one sees themselves as being a part of this project to expand democracy, everything has to be on the table when it comes to the courts. I'm heartened by the fact that President Biden is diversifying the federal bench across the country. I think that that is a helpful move. But we should make no mistake that the Roberts Court is a radical court. It is an extreme court when it comes to protecting the rights of racial and ethnic minorities. And so it's an uphill battle, which makes it even more important that Congress acts now to implement laws that protect the right to vote, that make it more difficult for the courts to act as the final arbiters when it comes to the rights of marginalized people.
Right. Okay, so before we turn it over to the audience, let's pick up on questions about the future, I suppose. So Barton Gellman has a scary article in The Atlantic warning about the prospects for future election violence and for complete subversion of an electoral outcome. And there's also divisions within the Republican Party itself, a MAGA faction evidenced by people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert in Congress. And then people like Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, who at this point are persona non grata in some ranks of their party, but nonetheless represent what we might think of as a pro-democracy wing of the right. What do you think are the prospects for the Republican Party in the midterm elections this year? And what does that mean for which wing of the Republican Party has leadership and power moving forward?
Yeah, so much there, Didi. I just note first that everyone should read this current issue of The Atlantic that Didi is making reference to. It's not just this piece that January 6th was practiced. George Packer has an introductory essay in the magazine where he writes compellingly that it can get worse, and that one of the things that the left and pro-democracy advocates are missing is the ability to imagine that it can get worse. And so I just commend to all of you the entirety of this issue of The Atlantic. Didi, I'm going to take issue, I think, with your description of the Republican Party as having a kind of pro-democracy faction and an anti-democracy faction. I think more precisely what the Republican Party has is a very large faction of people who are willing to countenance a violent attack on the country that we saw on January the 6th, and a very small faction of folks who don't like that sort of not very respectable attack on democracy. Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger do not support advancing the Freedom to Vote Act. They stand in opposition to democracy enhancing policies. I therefore don't place them in some pro-democracy faction. I'm heartened by the fact that when they see fellow Americans storming the Capitol and the president to stoke this racial violence and this attack on democracy, that they have the good sense to say that that is beyond the pale, that crosses some line. But I actually don't give people much credit for doing the obviously right thing. And that's the obviously right thing. What I'm bothered by is that neither Liz Cheney nor Adam Kinzinger see that it's not just this very vivid attack on democracy that is taking hold in this country, but instead the routine attacks on democracy brought about by their fellow co-partisans. I think that we should award that kind of courage, a courage to stand in the face of these routine attacks on democracy and say, we won't countenance that either. And so I think this Republican Party, which stands in broad opposition to democracy enhancing policies, is the Republican Party that will carry the day. Liz Cheney will have tough opposition. If I recall, Adam Kinzinger is stepping down from Congress.
That's right.
I think it is pretty clear to us which variant, pardon the pun, I suppose, of the Republican Party will persist. We currently, and it gives me no comfort to have to note this truth, we currently have a pro-democracy party and a party that stands in stringent opposition to democracy. And I have a very hard time carving out in that party, in the Republican Party, any large faction of those Republicans, even among the respectable crowd that stands arm and shoulder to shoulder with pro-Democrats, small d Democrats. And I think that should give us all a lot of angst.
So my final question before we turn it over to what are some great audience questions coming in has to do with more globally, the fact that illiberalism and authoritarianism has been ascendant, particularly in the very recent 21st century. And many of these leaders are elected to power through democratic elections. Then they use their time and power to consolidate their power by manipulating election results and rules, by making sure that their political loyalists are installed in high positions of power, and by politicizing neutral democratic institutions. I don't disagree at all that the Republican Party constitutes at this point an existential threat to American democracy. I'm trying to look for some hope in how we get out of this. Who are the other stakeholders? Who else in American politics besides the Democratic Party, the obvious opposition, and the majority party currently? Who else, citizens, businesses, other groups, other countries, can we turn to mobilize against, a sort of sliding or erosion of our democracy?
I think this is a really great question. I too want to find some hope. So hopefully I can get there. My students, when I taught the Intro to American Politics class themed in defense of democracy, many of them would ask, Professor, this is sort of depressing. Where's the hope or the optimism? And I think there is hope and optimism. As I wrote to students about police violence, there's hope and optimism in struggle. And the very fact that there are many folks, there are millions of people in this country who support the expansion of democracy. That gives me some hope, that there are people on the ground every day working to make real the promise of democracy. That gives me some hope. That's where my optimism lies. But I think at this moment, a crucial agent in this story, a crucial actor, is the American media. How do we tell the story of the crisis of American democracy? And I've been most disheartened, I'll admit, by those who have platforms, those who have access to broad publics, who are engaged in a kind of big brain diagnosis of what this moment means. They're so hell-bent on finding a contrarian point of view that they can't just tell the truth as it is so clearly being rendered to all of us. And so I think in this moment, an actor that I've been pressing in online spaces a lot are those who have the capacity to really clearly outline for the American people what is at stake. And I think this is sort of elite and traditional media outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post, where they have an obligation in this moment of democratic crisis, not to both sides this issue, but to tell the American people the truth. And to my friends who are political pundits or commentators, they too have an obligation to do more than write for clicks, but to really render for the American people what is at stake and the nature of the crisis that we face. And my deep concern is that the incentive structure is not such that these folks feel compelled to do that. And so I hope if any of these folks are tuning in, that they will see this moment for what it is, a real moment for clarity, for courage, and in light of Desmond Tutu's recent passing, I'm going to butcher this, but I think one of its greatest lines is that sometimes neutrality, right, simply helps the oppressor. And in this case, those who stand in opposition to democracy, I think, should be faced with the full kind of pushback from those of us who believe in the promise of democracy. And so I hope my friends in the media see themselves as serious stakeholders here, because they have an obligation, I think, in this moment to do the right thing.
Great. Okay, so we'll turn it over to the audience, and I'm going to identify everyone by name, although I don't know all of you. But I wanted to start with this question of media. You're absolutely right that the media landscape has changed, and inevitably those of us who study American democracy get questions about social media. So Valeria Caro is asking if the assault on the Capitol affected the way politicians communicate through social media. We certainly know that the platforms, for example, have tried to penalize, they took Donald Trump off Twitter. They have tried to sanction people like Marjorie Taylor Greene or identify their tweets as problematic. What do you think about the role of information and how it spreads these days? And how does that help either Democratic or Republican candidates and their messaging?
Yeah, so I had an interview at some point several months ago with a technology journalist about this very point. So perhaps, Didi, we can find that and maybe put it somewhere that folks can access. But I think these technology companies certainly have an obligation to think about the role that they're playing. I believe in a lot of speech, even nasty, ugly speech. Uh, that's my sort of prior as a liberal, as one who believes in the importance of speech, even nasty, ugly speech. Okay. With that said, the Constitution makes it such that governments shouldn't infringe on individuals' right to free speech. I think it's a different kind of obligation for technology companies. Of course, we should worry about, and I certainly worry about, what it means to empower these institutions, many of which are not too far from where I'm sitting, to decide what's acceptable speech and not acceptable speech. Uh, but Zuckerberg and others surely have to reckon with the possibility, not the possibility, the reality that their platforms are used to stoke violence of the sort that we saw last year. The literature is mixed on the extent to which these echo chambers, as scholars call them, exist, the extent to which they heighten violence or the like.
Right.
But I think the literature is pretty clear when it comes to exposure to this kind of rhetoric and the like only exacerbates the problem. And so perhaps as a final bit of this answer, my colleagues Liliana Mason and Nathan Calmo have some forthcoming work on radical kind of partisanship and political violence. And one of the bits that they highlight in this work is that it matters what kind of elite rhetoric citizens are exposed to. And some experimental work that they've done when folks are exposed to a kind of rhetoric that calls for calm or kind of non-violent rhetoric, people are less likely to support violence, right? And so to the extent that we're worried about this kind of thing, I think platforms have to concern themselves with elite rhetoric on their platforms, but also the fact that these places provide community for extremism. And
Right.
so I think it's a hard problem, particularly for those of us who believe in speech, but it is a problem that I hope that these companies and organizations are taking care to attend to.
Great, and thank you for the citation to Radical American Partisanship by Liliana Mason and Nathan Calmo. They gave a talk at CDDRL last year, so we have that somewhere on our CDDRL YouTube page for people who are interested. So there's another question from Marissa Kellum, one of our visiting scholars at CDDRL, about voting rights being crucial, but also what about the Electoral College? So the fact that the January 6th riots happened during routine certification was because we certify election results through a slate of electors from each state rather than through a popular vote, for example, for the president. So what do you think are the prospects for Electoral College reform? We know that 2 Republican presidents who lost the popular vote became president in the 21st century. Is there public momentum behind that? And do you think it's something that is likely among a slate of other democratic reforms that could be pursued?
Yeah, I like to say that as a scholar, as a public-facing scholar, I try to speak plainly and tell the truth. And the truth is, I just don't see that happening anytime soon. But the question presents an opportunity to make note of the fact that American politics is comprised by many counter-majoritarian institutions.
Yeah.
The Electoral College being but one of them. And so in my day job, I spend a lot of my time thinking about American psychologies and how they come to their attitudes. I would commend to folks a lot of work by scholars of political institutions who have written, I think, brilliantly, thinking about these counter-majoritarian institutions and the way that they maintain these sort of anti-democratic elements in American politics. The US Senate being another counter-majoritarian institution that, and we're seeing in real time the challenges that poses for those who support expanding democracy. And so the question for me just reminds of the real uphill battle those of us who support the expansion of democracy face, because you can win the presidency in this country, as others have seen and observed, without winning a majority of the public's votes. And that should probably worry us, as it does the question asker.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to combine two questions from Melanie Burkett and Victor Madrigal. One of them asks actually about Desmond Tutu and about Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in particular as a tool to for post-conflict societies or very divided societies to overcome previous injustices or divisions. And the other question from Melanie Burkett is about the January 6th Commission. The reason to combine these questions is because we do have an effort right now, admittedly not a bipartisan one, to investigate what happened on January 6th and to hold people accountable. We have Merrick Garland saying yesterday that he is going to use the DOJ and all tools at his disposal to go after people who are guilty, to understand the entire chain of command that led to these events. Joe Biden, of course, this morning given a super passionate speech about President Trump specifically by name and his responsibility in promoting violence and lies about election results. Do you think that a commission's findings about responsibility at the highest levels of government towards January 6th events, or some other type of effort like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission could help us restore at least some of the foundational principles of American democracy?
Maybe, but you have to have some. You have to have some shared sense of the truth. I mean, truth and reconciliation requires some acceptance of the truth, right? And so I think the challenge here, like, I would love for us to have a moment of reckoning, a word that I feel like I've been using all day everywhere. But that requires that we have a shared understanding of the crisis that we're facing. And this is a place where my expertise is, I think, quite relevant, the kind of psychological work that I do. People can fashion all sorts of stories about the world. Some colleagues and I write about this in terms of people's reactions to police shootings of Black people, how white and Black Americans can fashion different narratives about the world. And what we are seeing today is that Republicans have fashioned a narrative about January the 6th that is so far removed from the truth that if you spend a lot of time listening to them, you begin asking yourself, what the hell did I witness on January the 6th? And so I wish that we were at this place where I could imagine something like a Truth and Reconciliation opportunity, but it would require that Republicans and Republican elites and members of the mass public, rank and file Republicans, accept what actually happened. I mean, and when you hear some recent interviews have made clear folks saying that this was the FBI, this was Antifa, this was Black Lives Matter, as we heard from elected officials, these were plants. We are in a moment of crisis because the information that some people consume is so otherworldly. It's so out of this universe. And that, I think, makes it really difficult for me to imagine a sort of coming together, a kumbaya moment that I think we all would hope would come. And that's why in this moment, Democrats have an obligation to use the power that they have. And I say this not as a partisan, though I'm sure it might sound like that to some. I say this as someone whose bias is in the direction of democracy. That Democrats have an obligation to use every tool at their disposal, the force of their power, to use the institutions to respond to these crises. Because the changing of hearts and minds in this moment seems quite a challenging way to go.
Okay, so there are two really good questions here from Alberto Diaz-Calleros at CDDRL and Brett Carter, who was a visiting scholar with us. So Brett Carter, fellow South Carolinian, and I'm from Georgia, is noting that the South has long not been democratic, there was a long period of what Rob Mickey calls subnational authoritarianism that literally excluded Black Americans from the vote, and that we see that play out in repercussions in our contemporary politics, that there are probably many people in the South, particularly with power, who never fully embraced a multiracial democracy and have gone to quite great lengths to ensure that that project doesn't succeed. Similarly, Alberto Diaz-Calleros is noting that in Latin America, there has been a real realignment of party systems, given that previous party systems and iterations of them often worked by excluding and disenfranchising many segments of society, including indigenous populations and minority populations. So I think it's safe to say that many democracies have long met a sort of minimal procedural definition of democracy, having free and fair elections and democratic institutions, but were often built on broader exclusionary patterns where no major party really claimed to represent or even allow minority or indigenous voices. And that we now see much more pressure and calls for opening up those political systems, but also tensions with parties that have not really crafted their appeals that way for decades. So what do you think are the prospects for a realignment? It doesn't sound sustainable to have a party of white nationalism in the United States, but we have a two-party system. It's going to be very difficult for a third party ever to win, especially at the national level. So what do you think are the prospects for a political realignment or for the Republican Party to sort of adapt to modern times?
Wow. Yeah. Thank you for this question. Thank you all for this question. First, I just want to note that Rob Mickey, a mentor and friend of mine from the University of Michigan, we should all engage Rob's work. He uses the language of comparative politics to think about the lack of democracy across the American South, calls these authoritarian enclaves. And this same line of brilliant scholarship, I would commend to folks a piece by Veshla Weaver and Gwen Prowse that makes this case so compellingly that political scientists have long been obsessed with this sort of procedural form of democracy, this minimalist understanding of democracy, that we've been obsessed with the right to vote, free speech and free expression. And I just want to join company with these concerns that my friends Veshla and Gwen articulate in their work. And it's to say, for a lot of marginalized communities, and let me be more precise, for Black people in particular, Black people from places that I know and visit for them, the promise of democracy has never been realized. What to the over-policed and the over-surveilled is democracy, one might ask. And so it's hard, because to have a kind of multiracial democracy, it means more than having access to the ballot sort of equitably distributed across salient social groups. It has to mean more than that. It has to mean that Black men and women don't have to worry about abuses from the state. That they don't have to worry about dying at the end of a police officer's gun. And so I want us, like Veshla, like Rob and Gwen, to have a more capacious understanding of what the promise of democracy would afford to an inclusive and diverse society. And so I like this question because it allows for that particular intervention, that more expansive view of what democracy means. And this is why I'm always careful to say that what I'm fighting for is not a status quo. It's not a return to normal. It's not even fighting for the democracy that we had. It is for the promise of democracy, right? That's never been fully realized. And
Right.
so I guess to borrow language from President Biden, it's a fight to build back better, to build a democracy that doesn't look like the democracy of old. It doesn't look like whatever contemporary form of democracy we might think we have, but for a promise of democracy that affords to all people in this country liberty and justice for all. And so I don't know the potential of the Republican Party maintaining its position as the party of white nationalism and white supremacy. I think ethnic parties of that sort can last for some time. I think what becomes more challenging for the party as this kind of extremism, and it's hard to call it extremism when it's sort of part and parcel of the party,
Yeah.
but what becomes challenging in a diverse society like ours is to continue to win elections with that kind of base of support. But here is the challenge for pro-democracy advocates. The Republican Party can advance an extremely radical rhetoric. It can countenance extreme and violent behavior because it does not need to win a majority of Americans' votes to maintain power. The counter-majoritarian nature of American politics allows the Republican Party to exist in this form because they don't need the support of moderates. They don't need the support of pro-Democrats. And so that's the real challenge, is that given the nature and the makeup of American politics, that an extreme Republican Party with the support and the sort of power of the Supreme Court, the US Senate, and the like and with opportunities to gerrymander districts, with opportunities to supplant and subvert the will of the people, I really worry that this radical and extreme Republican Party can exist far longer than any party of that sort should in a multiracial society.
Okay, that is depressing, Hakeem. But we will ask a few more questions, and then I will try to end with a question about reforms that may be able to address some of these counter-majoritarian problems. There's a really interesting question from Anna Bigelow about the role of religion in this. You mentioned Reverend Warnock and Barber as doing work to defend democracy, but of course we also know that white nationalists often invoke Christianity to discuss sort of the symbols of the United States and what the United States ought to look like. This is very similar to other illiberal leaders, particularly in places like Europe, who want a white Christian nationalist state as well. And they set it up to be explicitly anti-immigrant, for example, and anti-outsiders, people who are seen as other. So how do you think about divisions within religious groups in the United States as well? And when can it be sort of a tool for democracy and when can it not be?
Yeah, I mean, like all aspects of American society, race colors the role that religion plays in American life. Reverend Warnock comes from a kind of Black liberation tradition, right? Where the kind of Christianity that he, that King, that Barber, that others sort of subscribe to is a Christianity of liberation. There's a liberation theology to use the tenets of scripture to advance the freedom of Black folk and other marginalized groups, right? We see it in the religion of a Desmond Tutu, right? But in the US, there has long been a white evangelical front that has stood in opposition to multiracial democracy, to the advancing of rights for racial and ethnic minorities. And I have a graduate student, Ellen Chapin, who is doing some really brilliant work to conceptualize, to measure, to help us understand the nature of white nationalism in the US. And I've been learning a lot from Ellen and the work that she's doing, but we can think about these anti-maskers, for example. We can think about those who stormed the Capitol a year ago. We can think of them as believing that they have some divine right to self-governance, and not just the kind that all of us believe that we have in this country, but a kind of divine right to a certain place in the racial hierarchy, a sort of entitlement not given by man but by God, right? To rule and to sort of be above the ruling of others. And I think in this moment, and there are others who know far much more about the role of religion than I do, but in this moment, to understand this moment, we can't disconnect it from a racialized white evangelical front that has long done damage to democracy, that has long obstructed the advancing of rights for racial and ethnic minorities. And so I'm still learning about this too, but I think there's a lot of good work out there that folks can go and engage. But I think the question is a good one, that we can't ignore the way that white evangelical religion is factoring in here.
Okay, so our final question is, picking up on your theme of the convergence of so many things, counter-majoritarian institutions and racially exclusionary politics, the rise of dangerous violence and nationalism, we know that the United States history has been one in which these themes have cropped up over and over again. And there have been times when our nation has been more violent and more divided and more exclusionary than today. We have people, even in our own institution, who say that we have high levels of turnout in the 21st century, and that democracy is very healthy, that this is just the open exchange of ideas. What kinds of reforms do you think are urgent? You mentioned some at the top, the bills that the Democratic Congress is considering now. I don't like to ask magic wand questions, but if tomorrow you could implement 2 or 3 reforms that you think could go far to restore some health to American democracy, what would they be?
Yeah, so I'll just start by noting that those folks who are making claims that democracy is healthy, that we're all just sounding alarms because we like sounding alarms, and like, those people are wrong, and history will prove them to be wrong. The contemporary moment proves them wrong. And so I have to be on record saying that. To point to turnout as a measure of the health of democracy, what a cheap way to get out of the problems and the difficulties that we face. And so thank you for the opportunity to say that. When it comes to the question of magic wand, what to do, many elements of this are a part of Democrats' proposals to advance these democracy enhancing policies. We should end partisan gerrymandering. We should make it so that no state legislature can subvert the will of the people. We should protect voting rights and have a floor beneath which no state can go when it comes to the franchise. We should nationalize these standards. My dear friend and brilliant scholar, Jake Grumbach, has some really powerful work that just really pushes against the idea that federalism is always good, that it's always democracy enhancing. Jake has a forthcoming book on this topic, but also has articles that he's written where he showcases the way that in Republican-led states, democracies are backsliding quite quickly. And so the more that we can centralize some of these aspects of our politics, namely when it comes to voting rights and the like, I think the better. And 2, I think that we have to think seriously about the role that the Supreme Court plays in our politics. We cannot ignore the political and radical nature of this court. Democrats who believe in democracy must engage all possibilities when it comes to the court, expanding the court, thinking seriously about the tenure of judges on the court, etc. All of that should be on the table. To the extent that we can intervene institutionally and the crisis of democratic backsliding in this country, I think all the better.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Hakeem, for these brilliant insights and for really explaining so much of what is happening in the country since last year's attacks on the US Capitol on January 6th. Thank you to our audience for tuning in. We are going to try to assemble some of the citations that were brought up today, some of the references to especially Professor Jefferson's work that we'll be able to put together for everyone. And we hope that everybody out there stays vigilant, stays active, and concerned about the state of American democracy. Thank you so much, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you all for having me. Take care.
Thanks, Hakeem.